Whether I'm perceived as a more left-wing person or a more right-wing person depends a lot on who I'm talking to and what we're talking about. I feel like there's some disconnect where a lot of right-wing ideas or a lot of right-wing language, imagery, or rhetoric doesn't really connect with right-wing politics. For example, in America today, if you believed in liberty, rule of law, the Constitution, checks and balances on government power, if you believe in tradition and decency, if you believe in pursuing free trade with other nations, these are all things that kinda sound right-wing, but if you actually valued all of these things, then obviously you would prefer Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. And yet people who claim to care about these things will just go ahead and vote Republican anyway. In so doing, they not only throw away those values in practice, but they also, in the eyes of any third-party observer, taint all of those values and the associated language by making it appear as though those values are connected with those politics. Though it wouldn't be at all practical today, I do wish that I could refer to myself simply as a conservative. In a better timeline, this probably would have been an apt description of my own attitude and philosophy, or my own way of thinking about politics. I really do appreciate or cherish our society as it is, despite its flaws and despite all of the bumps along the way. I feel like we've ended up in a fairly good place. I celebrate our history, I defend our institutions and traditions. I tend to be against quick change and prefer things done by cautious gradualism whenever possible. I'm wary of radical movements that aim to change too much too quickly, or with too little an appreciation for the way that our existing systems work. I very much prefer things that are grounded in real experiences, and I'm again wary of political aims that seem to be based too purely on the abstract, that take as their starting point not the existing society that we're living in, but some imagined ideal, whatever that may be. I mean, look at this. I should be able to call myself a conservative with this bunch of descriptors applied to me. But the title of being a conservative, at least in the English-speaking world, has effectively been stolen from people like me, and is now used primarily to identify the latest wave of anti-intellectual populism, cultural, reactionary, and especially religious bigotry, and divisive, grievance-based authoritarianism that has wrapped itself in the language and rhetoric of traditional conservatism like a demon wearing flayed human skin. I started telling people that if I did live in America, I would surely be supporting their Democratic Party. For that matter, I'm not even too fond of the so-called conservatives in my own country, or in some other countries that I know of, and often the retort has been, then you're not a conservative. This is because the layman decoding of political descriptors is mostly just casting them into political party names. So a liberal is somebody who votes for the Liberal Party, a conservative is somebody who votes for the Conservative Party, I suppose a socialist might just be somebody who votes for the Socialist Party, and so on. This despite how disconnected party names and the ideas for which they were named have become in practice. There may have once been a connection of some kind between the US Republican Party and the idea of republicanism. I don't know what that connection was, but maybe it existed. But if it did exist, it doesn't exist anymore. Today the name is essentially meaningless. The two parties are called the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but they both believe in democracy, and they both, well, actually, I guess the Republican Party, until recently, they both believed in democracy and they both believed in republicanism. So what did the names tell you? Nothing. They could have just been called the Red Party and the Blue Party, or Party A and Party B. It really doesn't matter. For me, this disconnect between the underlying political ideas and the labels used in everyday conversation, which are mostly just references to party names, or I guess, kind of just shallow connections. Like in American discourse, when they say conservative, I'm not sure exactly what that's supposed to mean, other than somebody who is right-leaning or somebody who votes for the Republican Party, because it sure doesn't seem to be connected to the actual historical ideas of conservatism. MAGA or Trump supporters are definitely not conservatives. But for me, this disconnect provided all the more reason to want to talk about the underlying ideas, and to perhaps rescue those ideas in your mind from the realm of electoral politics, where a thing apparently is whatever it decides to title itself. So how should a person understand me as a commentator? I'm a moderate, I'm a centrist, I'm a liberal, I'm a traditionalist, I'm a conservative. These are all words that I feel should fairly well apply to me. I believe that our traditional ideas are worth understanding, studying, and defending, which is what I'm going to be doing here. Now, it may seem like a losing battle, if not a war already lost, to lay claim to a word against a great sea of people whom I allege are misusing it, but greater shifts in language have happened before, and even if I never succeed, which I suppose I'm not betting on, raising the dispute at least creates an opportunity for discussion about the merits of my challenge. So what is conservatism? When I say conservative thought or conservative ideas, what am I talking about? In the first sense that we often speak of, conservatism is not directly a political platform or position. It doesn't tell us what the government should or shouldn't do, it doesn't tell us what laws we should or shouldn't have. Rather, it's what I would describe as a meta-political philosophy, or for a simpler description, a political attitude. That is, an attitude about politics. It references not what things you support, but the method or attitude by which you determine which things you support. In this sense, a person could loosely be considered a conservative in any type of society, and indeed we have referred to people as being conservatives in pretty much every kind of society, including in communist societies. In the late Soviet Union, those people who wanted to maintain rule by Moscow were called the conservative communists, in the sense they were the old guard who wanted to preserve the system that had been in place for decades, especially by supporting the '91 coup attempt by people who opposed Gorbachev and Yeltsin. But of course, the kind of society these people wanted was rather different from what is desired by the people who are called conservatives in our countries, because they are applying that meta-level attitude to a different type of society, which by this point had a different constellation of history, values, and institutions. The conservatism that we're interested in is a distinctly Western conservatism, which was first articulated in the West and which came about as a result of applying this attitude to Western societies. So from here on out, that is what I'm referring to when I say conservatism. I don't mean a conservatism that exists in China or in Saudi Arabia. I don't have any commitment to analogues to our conservatism that we perceive in other societies, which may be seeking to defend a wholly different set of values from ours. The application of a conservative attitude to our societies gives rise to certain trends, patterns, or currents, which in turn give content to conservatism as a real governing ideology. The patterns in question may sound familiar to you in broad strokes. We end up talking about things like order, merit, hierarchy, a skepticism toward radical notions of equality, resistance to movements that try and change too much too quickly, or through an otherwise impoverished methodology, and a defense of Western liberal values and governing institutions, including our traditional understanding of liberty and of individual rights. I feel the stereotype of a conservative in many ways is a person who is all too prim and proper, somebody old-fashioned to a fault, stagnant, perhaps timid in their orthodoxy, unable to adapt to the changing world around them. They cling in fear to what is familiar to them because the world outside is changing and change is scary. Now you may depict and mock such a stereotype if it pleases, but the real history of conservative thought has been touched by many eccentric and unorthodox people with brave souls, strong spirits, and clear minds. Far from an expression of meekness, to hold fast and stand your ground, to defend your principles instead of getting swept up in the latest fashionable craze, this resilience often takes great courage and conviction to weather the storm that so many people around you have succumbed to. Even in my case, it would surely be easier, potentially more profitable, if I set aside all conflicting thought from my mind and I simply adopted the opinions that I thought were most popular with the crowd that I was trying to appeal to. But I choose not to do that. The person who is by all counts most credited with developing what we now understand as conservative thought is Edmund Burke, a British member of Parliament in the 18th century, remembered most of all for his Reflections on the Revolution in France, a pamphlet published in 1790. As there really is nobody else whose status as a conservative is so unquestioned, a quick review of his qualities may help to dispel some misconceptions. Burke wasn't a blustering patriot who thought his country could do no wrong and opposed all change. He was rather critical of Britain in some respects, and as a politician he actively proposed ways to improve the country, which obviously means by changing it in some way. He thought it was immoral that Britain participated in the slave trade, for example, and even proposed banning all slaveholders from Parliament. He opposed capital punishment, the norm in his lifetime. And he advocated on behalf of the rights of groups that he thought were being mistreated, like the Indians and the Irish. That's the Indians actually in India, not the American Indians. Nor did Burke oppose the very idea of progress in either a social or political sense. On the contrary, he understood that change is necessary for preservation, for in politics, as in so much else of life, that which cannot adapt at all to the ever-changing circumstances life throws our way cannot expect to survive in the long term. What really interested Mr. Burke, and what continues to interest conservatives to this day, is not an attempt to crystallize this or any other moment in time for all eternity, but pursuing change that comes about through a natural order of events in a manner that is sufficiently cautious and gradual, that respects our established institutions and traditions, and which is undertaken with due moral consideration. I'll be fleshing out the meaning of some of these points as the video progresses. An area that's worth clarifying is, what are traditions and what are institutions? Traditions and institutions are often the focus of praise in conservative writing and used as a quick summary of those things that we ought to be preserving. But what exactly am I talking about when I use these terms? For many readers, these terms are a bit nebulous, lacking any specific content, and in the absence of concrete example, tradition is often taken as a term for, especially frivolous, practices from centuries ago. It may bring to mind the dated table etiquette of a formal dinner party, or a religious ceremony performed by a man in robes and a funny hat who doesn't believe in birth control. Or maybe a practice like coloring eggs on Easter, which, while it isn't harmful, surely isn't of any great importance to the survival of civilization either. Meanwhile, institutions, you say? Which ones? The government? The big banks? Are we just praising the ruling class? That probably isn't too appealing for somebody who's unhappy with the general state of things, which these days seems to be at least half of us at any given moment. So let's be more clear. The term institution, which comes from the Latin institutio, I don't actually speak Latin, institutio, so this means any organization or establishment that people had to put together, which comprises, along with other such things, the general form or structure of society. The government, with all of its departments and agencies, is of course one major institution. But I would say also our companies and corporations, our schools, research facilities, churches, guilds, clubs, unions, our healthcare infrastructure, clinics, hospitals, pharmacies, insurance companies, and the web of relations between them, our legal system, the courts, the prison system, the military, print and broadcast media, which is to say newspapers and television stations, any other media infrastructure, studios, art galleries, theaters, museums, libraries, conservatories, and all of the other miscellaneous offices and bureaucracies that connect all of these things and make them all work together, that allow them to function as the organs of broader society. And then at the base of it all, you have the traditional household and family structure in which we all begin our lives, which many people also refer to as a sort of institution. These are all the sorts of things that we're referring to when we talk about the institutions of a given society. All the things that would be suddenly absent if everything were washed away, if you and a few other people were suddenly stranded together on a deserted island. Now as for tradition, this comes from the Latin meaning to give, to hand over, or to deliver. This refers to any belief, norm, or convention which, once established, is passed on between people over time by way of one person teaching the next, rather than each generation of people needing to rediscover everything for itself. This is most strongly associated with intergenerational knowledge, parents teaching things to their children or grandchildren. But there's also more figurative senses of generation, such as the employees at a company teaching certain practices to new hires, or different generations of researchers passing on all of their knowledge to the people who come after them. This is still reasonably within what we intend when we talk about traditional knowledge. If you yourself have knowledge of any reasonably advanced field, you can probably bring to mind numerous examples of effectively traditions within that field, Arguably, the concept of tradition can also be stretched to include any given social construct, such as language or the law or good manners. These things are not usually what we mean when we say tradition, but they are kind of understandable as types of tradition. For example, why does the word desk refer to a desk? That certainly isn't something that I would have come up with on my own. For me, the only reason that noise means that object is because I was taught by the people who came before me that that's what everybody else uses that noise to mean. So the word desk is just the traditional noise that is used to refer to the object of a desk. In a broad sense, tradition includes and is often represented by cultural tradition, such as holidays, festivals, rituals, etiquette, clothing, music and dance, food and drink, stories and folklore, art, literature, architecture. These things are a lot easier to represent and visualize. But tradition also includes more serious things that are less interchangeable. Things like the presumption of innocence, equal protection under the law, the rules of succession in a monarchy, our idea about the right balance of trade-offs when it comes to the applications of an abstract principle like freedom of speech, or any of the rules and procedures by which a parliament is organized and operates. Norms and customs, whether within a family, within science, business, or international politics, or anything else, is all conceptually within what we mean by tradition. Now, I think it's worth understanding that cultural tradition is not frivolous. It's often spoken of as though it's frivolous because the specific items that comprise it are interchangeable before they're established. This requires some clarification. Why does it matter for the functioning of a country whether people are listening to English pop or salsa music? Whether their traditional dress looks like this or that? It doesn't really. These things are just cultural artifacts, the expressions of a people. But let's reduce our scope to something more personal. Suppose I have a number of cherished family heirlooms, things that I've inherited from my grandparents and great-grandparents. Let's imagine I have an old teapot that was made 150 years ago and was used by my great-grandmother. The reason this item has value to me is not simply for its utility, which could be replicated by any random teapot at a store. The value of the teapot comes from its origin and my personal knowledge of and relationship to that origin. It doesn't really matter which specific teapot my great-grandmother went out and bought all those years ago. Any teapot that she brought home back then would have eventually become the teapot that I have now. But this is the teapot that she chose, so this is the one that I have. Now, if I could go back in time and tell her, no, buy that other teapot instead, well, then the present would be fundamentally unchanged. I would have just ended up with a different teapot, and all of the sentimental, familial, or historical value that I placed on the teapot that I currently have, I would have just ended up placing on this other one instead, because it would have been the one that went through the same chain of possession. This kind of thought leads some people to think that the content of cultural tradition doesn't really matter. You can just kind of swap things around and not much will change, because functionally, what does it matter which exact teapot you were left with? So we can move a country's demographics and culture and have it all shift about, and it doesn't really matter the loss of cultural tradition. Society will just carry on, but maybe listening to different music, maybe eating different food, maybe wearing different kinds of clothing. It doesn't really matter. It's all interchangeable. They probably acknowledge the value of certain political traditions, like the separation of church and state, or maintaining a free press. But they don't appreciate the role that our cultural tradition has in making people feel connected to, invested in, and actually care about the fate of the polity in the first place. It's like the difference between going back in time and having my great-grandmother buy a different teapot versus showing up to my house tomorrow and just taking my teapot and giving me a different one. Well, I don't care about that one. You can't just change them out after it's already been established. So sure, it was not important in any practical or utilitarian sense which specific food became our national dish, or what style of clothing became our traditional dress. But after being established as such, these things became important to us because they're ours. It's about the relationship, the connection, the history. These things all become part of what makes our communities feel like home, that cause us to feel unity with one another and invested in our shared future. And that sense of unity and investment is what motivates us to be willing to make sacrifice in the form of restraint on our behavior and commitment to various duties for the purpose of securing our shared success. I think there would be a grand unraveling of political legitimacy if a country were somehow robbed of this connection between the individual and the collective, and the connection between current generations and past generations, which is part of what's provided by this landscape of shared cultural experience. And to be sure, I don't argue that our specific culture is the best in all possible ways. I don't think that we're superior to everybody else. But the fact that our culture is our culture means it fulfills something for us that nothing foreign could ever fully replicate. Earlier I used the term a natural order of events. To speak of a natural order of events may sound like it's some kind of teleological view, as though there's only one correct or maybe even possible way for history to go forward, one predetermined path that we are meant to go down. But even though it may sound like that, it's really not the intention of the term. Rather, it's used to imply a normative method, or some ideas about the correct way that one ought to pursue social change. Societal change is comparable to the growth of scientific knowledge, or the development of literary or musical tradition. We don't know what knowledge future people are going to have, what kind of things they are going to discover. But we do have some opinions about how research ought to be performed and verified, or what our attitude ought to be toward the knowledge that we've already accumulated. And we don't know what music future people will listen to or how they'll dress, but we may view a trend that emerges from free people choosing to do whatever they like rather differently from one that's mandated by some kind of overbearing ruler telling people what kind of music to listen to and how to dress. So we can be agnostic about the content, but have opinions about how things ought to move. And that's also the case when talking about societal development. Everybody knows that culture always naturally, gradually changes. It improves and refines itself over time as each generation reacts to the changing circumstances they have to navigate, or as their own experiential knowledge accumulates and they devise newer, better ways of dealing with problems that the people before them had to devise answers to as well. We might come up with a better way of solving the same things. This is why, although there is a family resemblance, my values are not identical to those of my parents, and my parents' values were not identical to those of their parents, my grandparents, and my grandparents' values were not identical to the values of my great-grandparents, so on forever. We all get to choose how much we adhere to what was passed down to us, and how much we choose to alter or stray from that path depending on how well it fits into our own lives. And there is no great reason to oppose personal experimentation that is engaged in by people who choose to take on the risk of trying something new, and who stand to bear all the cost if it goes awry in their own lives. But what is anathema to conservatism or traditionalism is any extensive or sweeping change to our social rules or institutions that affect people who are not volunteering to participate in this experimentation, it's just being foisted upon them by some kind of external force, and or proposals for change whose origin is only hypotheses rather than real, lived experiences. I think it's important to understand that the status quo of our society was not designed in a lab, nor could it have been. It came about gradually, iteratively, through the lives and experiences of all those people who came before us. It was their choices and their attitudes, their attempts at solving the problems they were faced with, that gave life to all of the culture and norms and institutions into which you and I were born. And now those things are passed down to us, so that we can pick up from where they left off. And there are certain responsibilities in that. We are not merely the recipients of a gift, we are expected to be its good stewards, to maintain its good qualities, so that we may one day pass down such things to those who come after us. We are but one node in a sequence, one link in the chain, one part of a grand multi-generational project. This framing affords great perspective about the world and about one's place within it. In deciding how to proceed, in deciding how to govern our society, we begin not from the vacuum of theory nor the dawn of history, but from the reality in which we find ourselves, which begins from what was left for us. It does not make any sense to treat the status quo as something that requires justification, as though it were still only a proposal for us to consider and then choose to either accept or reject. The pondering stage is behind us. It already is. What matters is only where we choose to go from here. This is why we say it is change that must justify itself to the status quo, not the other way around. If you have no justification to do anything, then you default to doing nothing, that is, carrying on as you were before. Of the many analogies available, I prefer to think of your society as a grand ship alone at sea. The ship is capable of going in any direction, so if you have a proposal, then very well, step up and make your case. But travel is expensive, and once we've started moving in a direction, it can take a while for us to stop and turn around. And if we do make a mistake and end up running into something, the consequences can be dire. And then to apply what I was saying earlier to the ship analogy, it would be quite nonsensical for you to demand that I justify traveling to the location where we already are. Whether or not it was a good idea for us to end up here, it's where we are. We can't just snap back to the docks and start over. This is our location. So if you want to make a plan, this is your starting point. If some of these points kind of sound like common sense, well, it's because they are. Most people agree with this way of thinking. It's pretty normal. But in the realm of political discourse, I do run into people with unfortunate frequency who argue against something not by presenting and then arguing for some alternative that they can make the case would be an improvement, nor even by making a case for how the dissolution of a given thing would be a benefit to us compared with maintaining it. Instead, they seem to argue from an imaginary position where the thing never existed to begin with, and then they put it on me to present an argument for building it in the first place, as though this established thing were a new proposal that needed justification for us to bother doing it. An example I remember running into last year was somebody who was suggesting that the government should not offer any kind of official recognition nor benefit from marriage. And I said, okay, well, why not? And their response was entirely just asking me, well, why should the government recognize marriage in the first place? It's like, well, it's not really my job to answer, is it? I don't have to justify recognizing marriage, we already do. But the fact that this is how he argued his point suggests that he's guilty of the exact defect in reasoning that I'm describing. The implication seems to be that until you are persuaded otherwise, until some justification is provided for any given thing, the default position should be to abolish anything that we examine. It was to counteract this very mindset that the British writer G.K. Chesterton long ago penned what has since become known as Chesterton's Fence, which very neatly encapsulates much of the conservative attitude. In the matter of reforming things, there is one plain and simple principle. There exists in such a case a certain institution or law, let us say for the sake of simplicity a fence or gate, erected across a road. The more modern type of reformer goes gaily up to it and says, I don't see the use of this, let us clear it away. To which the more intelligent type of reformer will do well to answer, if you don't see the use of it, I certainly won't let you clear it away. Go away and think. Then when you can come back and tell me that you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy it. There are reformers who get over this difficulty by assuming that all their fathers were fools, but if that be so, we can only say that folly appears to be a hereditary disease. But the truth is that nobody has any business to destroy a social institution until he has really seen it as an historical institution. If he knows how it arose and what purpose it was supposed to serve, he may really be able to say that they were bad purposes, or that they have since become bad purposes, or that they are purposes which are no longer served. In many areas of life, the attitude expressed here by Chesterton comes to us as common sense that doesn't need to be articulated. Like, imagine walking into a factory and then, with no knowledge of any of the tools or machinery, you just point to something and you declare that because it's unclear to you what exactly that thing does, it must be useless and therefore safe to get rid of. Is that how anything in life works? A fence isn't a natural feature of the world like a tree or a rock. If somebody put it there, it was a decision they made and they must have had a reason for doing so. If we don't know what that reason was initially, then it becomes difficult to say whether their reason still applies because we don't even know what criteria to be testing for. Maybe the fence was built a century ago to enforce the boundary of private property that no longer exists. But then maybe it was built for a reason that would still be important today, it's just not apparent at this moment. For example, maybe it's only useful in winter, or during a flood, or when a flock of sheep come into town. Or some other condition that currently isn't being met, but probably will again someday. Sometimes if you remove a thing, only afterwards does it become clear what purpose it was serving, but by then it might be too late to just put it back where it was. It might be that because you got rid of it, we now have a serious problem on our hands that's going to be more difficult to solve than it was for you to take it out. This concern becomes all the more pertinent when faced with the possibility of revolutions, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. progress. If there is a natural order of events, then over a long enough period of time we could observe patterns in social development. In the beginning, everything is informal. Life is governed through deference to the authority of these highly localized decision-makers, your family hierarchy, clan elders, local religious leaders. In a sense, social rules are flexible because they're not actually written down. They're just informal attitudes, and then, again, deference to authority figures in the event of a dispute. So we can't reliably predict how any given situation is going to be resolved. In this phase, order is maintained largely through horizontal social pressure through concepts like status, honor, and shame, with local oral tradition serving as conflict resolution shelling points. So maybe if the village elders all tell a story of that a million years ago or whatever, there was once a god who got mad at another god and then they got in a fight on a mountain, and the solution ended up being that you had to pay the other person 1/3 of your crops or something, then maybe that somehow becomes a precedent, and then when there's a conflict, everybody agrees like, oh, well, you wronged Dave, so now you owe him 1/3 of your crops, and that just becomes like a rule of thumb that everybody just agrees to, and it's useful just because everybody is familiar with it, so it doesn't require very much haggling to get to that point. As society accumulates resources and increases in population, and as fairly separate local population clusters begin interacting with one another but under the same political authority, the formalization of social rules becomes highly desirable, because we're able to coordinate between these different groups more easily if there is a higher predictability of outcomes. In a more primitive social state, outcomes are only predictable insofar as you are familiar with the relevant authority figures and the way that they are likely to apply the existing traditions to any given situation. If there is no formal, written law of the land, then rules are highly personal, dependent on the whim of the person making the decision. Which is less of a problem if you're talking about a small tribe where everybody knows each other, but is more of a problem if you're talking about a huge city or empire where I might not know your local village elder. I've never interacted with him, so what am I supposed to do, and why should I trust his authority? The goal at this stage would be to establish the absolute basics, and here simplicity is prized. Simpler rules are easier for normal people to understand, to communicate to others, to memorize, and thus to follow by applying it to their own lives. In the past, the average person couldn't read anything more complex than a signpost, and written information was scarce. Laws had to be easily communicable through spoken word, and simple enough for normal people to understand and remember them. Simpler rules are also naturally going to have a lower enforcement cost. There would be less arbitration, less arguing, less time spent being unsure about what the law really says. Early religious laws, or things like the Code of Hammurabi, provide an interesting glimpse into early society's attempts at formalizing a set of rules. But over time, this brutal simplicity is naturally going to move in the direction of increasing complexity or sophistication. The law in an ancient society may have been as simple as, if you kill another person, then we'll kill you, with no attention paid to the different circumstances under which one person might kill another, whereas modern legal codes tend to distinguish between different categories of killing depending on the circumstance and the motivation, and we prescribe different punishments depending on which it was. This increase in complexity, or increasing sophistication, whatever we want to call this, allows us to be more precise in the way that we handle a given situation by recognizing a more diverse range of possible situations in the first place. It's like going from having one simple instrument to having a toolbox full of different wrenches and pliers for every situation that you could think of. This is how I interpret, and this is how I recommend other people to interpret, a lot of the social progress that our society has made, especially concerning women's rights and gay rights. We used to have very simple ideas in our culture of what life was supposed to be like, of what a man was supposed to be like, and what a woman was supposed to be like, what a relationship was supposed to look like. And our norms back then allowed for very little deviation from what we saw as how things ought to be. But over time, our conception of these things has changed, allowing for a greater diversity of input than existed before. And the diverse range of inputs was presumably always there, it just took some time for us to develop our culture to such a point that we had room to incorporate them. I think the main use of this insight is when it comes to describing countries that we call less developed than ours. Are we justified in saying that England has made social progress that, say, Romania has not? Are we further along than Romania, along some abstract line of progress that has a start point and an end point? If there are no universal truths or principles or destinations for cultures to develop, then all we could objectively say is that England has moved further along this line, but who's to say that Romania didn't stop at the perfect point and we've actually gone too far? We've overshot it. Maybe one day we'll back up to where Romania was. Maybe they got just the right balance. But when nearly every country has followed similar patterns of development, including Romania itself, relatively speaking, where seemingly every country has moved along this line and none of them stopped at where Romania was, and it's not like Romania has been there forever, they've been moving along the line too, it does make sense to suppose that they're probably going to carry on in England's direction. Another point we could make is that progress in this sense is not something external or alien or manufactured or implanted in society. It's not a perversion of our original values so much as it is a continuation of them. It is the further development and refinement of our values. We've seen that our countries tend to become more feminist and more tolerant of homosexuality over time. And it's not because anybody came and made us do this, it's because as our norms and laws changed, we chose to more effectively incorporate into our traditions the natural variation that already existed within our population. We had a concept of marriage that was a man and a woman, but there are some people in our society in every generation who are just never going to do that. So instead of just leaving them out in the cold, why don't we alter the way that this tradition works so that they have a way of fitting into it? This is where a conservative argument in favor of same-sex marriage comes from. Gay people exist. They just do. They're part of our society. They're part of our culture. Some part of every society, of every generation, is just gonna be gay. If marriage is such a beneficial practice for straight couples, then shouldn't it provide a benefit for gay couples too? Getting them to settle down and commit to just one person? By allowing gay marriage, we're effectively integrating the exceptions to a general rule, the homosexuals in a society where most people are heterosexuals, into the successful system that our culture has carved out. It seems like a modification to our norms that would better fit the needs of the existing population, and I can't identify any downside to doing this, so... Revolution is an important topic for conservatism. It was the French Revolution that served as a catalyst for Edmund Burke to express his conservatism back in the 1790s. Before I go any further, I'll clarify that I'm defining revolution to be any time some group circumvents the established or de jure procedure to install a new authority into power in a way that the system itself didn't allow for. Revolutions can vary in terms of how much they change, from, in some cases, the abolition of all norms, laws, property, and everything, to basically begin society from scratch with a new government and a new everything, to other revolutions where the general structure of government or of broader society kind of remains the same, but power changes hands from one group to another. And there could still be some reform. It's a gradient. There's sometimes a lot of reform, sometimes just a little bit of reform, but I'm defining revolution as the installation of a new power structure in a way that the previous system didn't allow for, regardless of where it falls on that continuum. I suppose ideally revolutions would never happen because there would never be a need for them, and it's obviously the goal of any state to prevent them from happening. But the best way to prevent revolutions isn't through brutal crackdown against revolutionaries after the conflict has begun. It's to prevent them from forming in the first place by being compromising and responsive to your people's demands, to address the people's grievances and allow for some changes to be made. An actual revolution occurs only as a last resort, when the state and its people have become totally misaligned, and a conventional, peaceful resolution of their differences is no longer possible. This tends to happen only after pressure has been building up for many years, during which the state holds fast and refuses to hear its people's demands. The most consequential revolution in all human history is the French Revolution of 1789. It is actually open to debate which revolution was the most consequential, but I am asserting that it was the French Revolution. Nobody would deny that it's at least a contender for the title. The French Revolution was a process that took multiple years and had identifiable phases, with the infamous decapitation of the royalty not actually happening until 1793. Edmund Burke, meanwhile in England, received updates about it as it unfolded, and became apprehensive earlier than most. In Britain at the time, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the deposing of the Catholic James II by his daughter Mary II and her husband, the Protestant William of Orange, lingered in the collective consciousness as a justified act of the people that led to the English Bill of Rights and confirmed the supremacy of Parliament over the Crown. So for Britons receiving news from France about a revolutionary group making a declaration about the universal rights of man while rebelling against King Louis XVI, an absolutist Catholic, it was very easy to compare these two events favorably and to cheer on the rebels. Not breaking from his contemporaries' positive view of the Glorious Revolution, Burke sought to explain his opposition to the French Revolution by distinguishing between these two events. To that end, he wrote his Reflections on the Revolution in France, condemning the revolution years before the Reign of Terror, already predicting the situation taking a turn for the worse. Burke would go down in history as the revolution's most noteworthy critic, while his reflections had a lasting impact on British conservatism and political thought in general. The American and English revolutions were, for comparison, shaped by their participants' belief in the common law, the rights and privileges that had been fleshed out over centuries by their ancestors. Neither movement sought to will into being a new social order from their imagination, so much as they were attempting to restore the balance of things and protect that which had already long been understood and respected. In France, however, opposition to the government was not being made with respect to any kind of long-standing custom or duty. They weren't saying, we need a new king because this one has failed his duty to the people or has committed great crimes against the nation. One could have said those things, but that's not how it was being framed. The revolutionaries' project was not the will of the French people nor the natural progression of French society. It wasn't trying to right a wrong and then return us to normal. Instead, the only thing being articulated was the radical philosophy of what Burke referred to as a literary cabal of revolutionaries, and their perspective was not grounded in history or in practical experience, but in abstract theory, in ideals that they wanted to impose onto French society. There was moreover a lack of appreciation for the role of France's own institutions in social stability. Over a century later, much of this critique could essentially be repeated or reapplied to the October Revolution in Russia. The Russian Empire had fallen into a period of instability and revolt, but in early 1917 it seemed like things might be taking a turn for the better. But then, instead of following in the footsteps of Western Europe, the most extreme faction of Russian society at the time, the Bolsheviks, resorted to using its own paramilitary group to take power by force, dismantle the burgeoning Russian parliament and its experimentation with democracy, outlaw all opposition parties, and rule Russia as a one-party state for the next 70 years. Much like in the French Revolution, the rise to power of the Bolsheviks was not the will of the Russian people, nor the natural progression of Russian society. It was another literary cabal come to impose its own radical philosophy onto a population unwilling. The vast majority of Russians were never Bolshevik supporters or communists, nor did they ask for the revolution the Bolsheviks imposed. But nor did that matter to the revolutionaries. The result in both the Russian and French cases was years of widespread repression and terrorism against anybody viewed as the enemies of the revolutionaries who were clinging to their newfound power. In France, the revolutionaries infamously made a spectacle of gruesome public executions, often of innocent people and not sparing women or children. In Russia, things got even worse. Communist forces, not as an act of random violence, but as a matter of policy, as a matter of order from on high, publicly tortured their opposition. In both cases, the purpose of this violence was trying to make it so that any normal person in the country was too afraid to oppose the new regime. Neither group afforded anybody the presumption of innocence nor any due process. They just killed anybody they wanted to. They were paranoid, viciously authoritarian, intolerant, and uncompromising. And uncomfortably, there are people alive today who view both of these revolutions positively and defend the view of the revolutionaries. So what is a good revolution? A good revolution is a course correction against tyranny. It's something that you hope never needs to happen, but unfortunately it is sometimes necessary. It's like political chemotherapy. Bad revolutions, on the other hand, which seem to be far more numerous in history, instead of being a course correction, cause us to veer off course into the jaws of tyranny. This occurs because a new authority installed by revolution feels threatened, unstable, and so in order to exist at all, they need to resort to lashing out against any sign of dissent. And this is a sort of gamble. If they're still in control when the dust settles, then things will eventually restabilize around them, and they may regain a sense of legitimacy. But if they lose, then they probably all die. In a sense, the high stakes of the situation may be what makes their brutality inevitable. Now, I just mentioned the idea of regaining legitimacy, and that's the next topic. What is legitimacy? Let's start with a case. Why was Louis the King of France? What made him king? If you were to ask him yourself, Louis may have said that his reign was justified by God. But we all know that no God was really coming down from the heavens to defend his claim. No God was fighting Louis's battles nor enforcing his words. Louis was only king because when he gave his orders, the men below him chose to obey. In a way, that's the only real power that any ruler has, the obedience of their followers. But why do they have that obedience? Why do these men-at-arms commit to obey the rulers they do? Why Louis and not somebody else? Of course, the answer lies in their own perception. Louis is not just some random brute ordering them around, he is the legitimate ruler of the country. His authority is the one that's recognized by the great body of French tradition and custom. They believe he is king, therefore they choose to obey him, and it's the fact they choose to obey him that makes him king in effect. So here, as in so much else of society, the reality is determined by people's actions, and people's actions are determined by their beliefs. Now, in the 21st century, the conventional account of legitimacy has been to say that it's derived from the consent of the governed. This has been said so much you might consider it common sense or conventional wisdom.
Authority should derive from the consent of the governed, not from the threat of force.
This view, while it is easily accepted by a lot of people, only kicks the can down the road. If legitimacy just means having consent, then okay, what makes consent? Why do people consent to some governments but not others? In a way, these questions are both attempts at investigating the same phenomenon. To credit legitimacy to consent implies a certain theoretical order of events. First, a government presents itself to the people, and then the people decide whether or not they consent to it, and if they do, then the government is legitimate. So legitimacy is just a description or a label that we apply to a government that has achieved consent. But it's far more clarifying to think of this relationship as kind of the other way around. Consent doesn't create legitimacy, consent is a response to legitimacy. That is to say, the people tend to accept and cooperate with, or consent to, authority that they perceive as being legitimate. And this returns us to the initial question, what is legitimacy? Legitimacy is that which causes a population to consent to your claim to authority, so we can approach this descriptively. First, there is a minimum utility threshold that must be met. In any given society, people want safety, stability, prosperity. The role of government is to secure these things and then effectively maintain law and order. People are often willing to go along with a system that achieves this, but they will eventually lose faith in the legitimacy of a government that does not. Now, this is usually trivially attainable. I guess it breaks down sometimes, but usually focus can be given entirely to the next 2 points. First is there's a feeling of genuine connection with the population. It's not merely some government, but our government. Like our parents, our family, our community. It's our government. A political community is necessarily one of shared identity, the speaking into being of a real group of people in which you consider yourself a member. The British political philosopher Roger Scruton articulated this when he said, "Politics is spoken in the language of the first person plural. We, us, ours." We care about and fight for what is ours, not for things that are alien or foreign to us, or something being imposed onto us by elsewhere. Monarchy and democracy are both strategies that help to ground this feeling of connection between the polity and the underlying social order, one through tradition, history, and lineage, the other through ritual, direct action, and participation. This is why even if the political party that you support loses the election, you still accept the results and consider the winner to be our government, our legitimate rulers. This is also why people in other countries don't vote in our elections. Why would they? They're not one of us. It's our democracy, not theirs. Finally, there's procedure. What kind of procedure? Whatever the tradition is. How do we know what kind of government will be successful going into the future? Well, basically we don't. So we offload that question onto various heuristics, the main one being compliance with established tradition and custom. Now for us today, that means the rules of parliamentary democracy. We trust that our way of doing things leads to effective leadership, ergo if a party has followed the rules or played the game correctly, they have earned legitimacy in our eyes because we believe in the process. Now, what exactly the traditional procedure is can vary a lot between populations or time periods. During the age of monarchy, the rules of succession were most important to us. In some places it could be some kind of religious rites or honoring the village elders, who knows. What's important is just that it's participation in and adherence to whatever is established with that population. So when we describe a government as being the legitimate authority of such and such, this tends to mean that it is truly of the population in question, that it's gone through the relevant procedure for that population, whatever that may be exactly, and of course it implies that the social order hasn't totally collapsed, resulting in people losing faith in their government. If the people view the government as legitimate, then they will consent to its authority. Liberty. To speak of tyranny, as I do in previous sections, implies some concept of liberty, some kind of standard that must be abridged for us to declare something tyrannical. Freedom, rights, and liberty are all easy words to rally behind. They basically have a universal positive connotation. After all, who doesn't love having rights and freedom?
Freedom, 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 oi! Freedom, 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 oi! Freedom, 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 oi! Freedom, 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 oi!
However, the rhetorical power of these words lies not only in their intuitive appeal, but in their convenient ambiguity, what they implicitly abstract away from the conversation. Anytime somebody uses the word freedom, ask yourself, freedom to do what? Or from what? And for whom? And at what cost? If we don't answer any of this, then we're not really talking about anything. You can't be an advocate for freedom in and of itself, or speak of a general freedom with no qualification. All freedom comes at a price, including the negation of other competing freedoms. We must weigh and choose between your freedom to shout versus my freedom from loud noise, your freedom to criticize or deride versus my freedom from insult or offense, your freedom to kill versus my freedom from being killed. It's not enough in any of these cases to say we should favor the side of freedom, because both sides are arguing for freedom for somebody, somehow. The real question is which of the potential freedoms at risk are of the highest priority. There's no simple method or principle that can answer all questions like this. It's not something that you could have solved a priori from a laboratory. It took us centuries of trial and error to reach the balance of things that we have now. Generations of debate, negotiation, conflict, experimentation, and compromise. And the resulting consensus, the resulting sense that we have of the correct way to balance two different competing freedoms in society, is what we're describing when we say liberty, which is a great accomplishment, perhaps the accomplishment of Western culture, and really the main way that we distinguish between a good society and a bad one. The most telling demonstration of morality is the way that you treat people who are at your mercy, and this is the case of whole societies too. Imagine you're wanted by the law, or a soldier at war. If you can't escape, do you consider surrender? Well, if it's the good guys you're fighting against, then the answer may be yes, because you can trust that you'll be treated fairly in our system. But if it's the bad guys you're fighting, you have to fear being tortured and abused, or just thrown in a prison to rot for the rest of your life without trial. Who knows? You might just be left to starve in the cold. You might be executed on the spot. This kind of distinction is clear in our history if we compare the Allies versus the Axis powers. It's why we consider mistreatment of prisoners of war to be such a bad thing. It's clear in present-day political differences. It's even reflected in our storytelling. If you think about the good versus the bad guys in Lord of the Rings, or Star Trek, or Game of Thrones. The good guys treat their prisoners humanely. The bad guys don't. That's a big part of why we consider them the bad guys. And this is why we're so attentive to and vigilant to fight against this kind of trampling of rights in our societies. Even though we're not perfect, and it does happen sometimes. But it's universally understood as bad when it does. That's why the American Guantanamo Bay prison is so controversial. They're doing some villain shit in there. This difference in attitude toward liberty or individual rights is the main reason that I wouldn't feel comfortable living in a corrupt second world country, no matter how nice and wealthy their cities may appear in travel brochures. I think what's far more important than any material wealth is the trust that I place in their institutions. The question shouldn't be what country has the nicest hotels, it should be in what place would you most want to be under police investigation, or made to appear in court, or have to spend time in prison, and in which place would you feel most comfortable speaking out against those in power. These are the questions that really speak to the virtue of a society in a way that something like crime rates or material wealth just can't. A belief in the importance of traditional liberty is today one of the main prongs of what we call liberalism. This became the predominant view in Europe after the Enlightenment, and has since become foundational to Western political culture. The related concepts began taking form under monarchist regimes where rulers often had absolute power, but when people felt as though the king had overstepped his bounds, there was conflict, and as a result the monarch would end up signing away some of his power by recognizing the rights of other people in society, and delegating more and more power to increasingly democratic institutions that existed in parallel with the crown, namely Parliament. The Magna Carta is famous for being a very early form of what I'm describing. Through these agreements over time, we slowly chipped away at the power of the monarchy. We moved from rule by personality in the direction of rule of law, meaning rules being formalized and existing independently from the whims of rulers. We moved in the direction of power being more democratic as opposed to autocratic and personalist in nature, both in terms of procedure, like elections, but also in terms of how we conceptualize the instruments of power. Hence we have language like republic, meaning the public thing, as opposed to the nation being something that belongs to the king. And of course we moved in the direction of liberty by clarifying the correct balance of freedoms and formalizing our laws in such a way that protected people's liberty from potential abuse by the government. So in a sense, liberalism can be understood as Western post-monarchism, or Europe's reaction to its own absolutist period. Notice how these three elements, liberty, democracy, and rule of law, didn't come about suddenly through a single explosion, a single revolution that transitioned us from absolute monarchy to modern governments. These are all trends that emerged over centuries, often with some growing pains. Sometimes a change to a law or institution appears kind of sudden, even if it took centuries for the underlying beliefs or attitudes to shift in such a way that enabled that change to happen. Sometimes it's just a matter of waiting for people in power to recognize and update our laws on the books to reflect the reality that has actually already existed for a little bit. For a recent example of this, a lot of countries legalized homosexuality after most people didn't really think it should be illegal anymore anyway. The social change happened for a while, and then at some point somebody had to realize, oh, there was a bunch of social change, okay, we'll update the laws now. Some of the big turning points that we look back on today were kind of the result of material or technological changes, putting pressure on an institution that may have eventually changed anyway, and maybe if it didn't have so much pressure put on it all at once it would have actually changed in a better way, but who knows. Like a tower that was starting to lean over, but then somebody gave it a push. In the early modern period, there was an agricultural revolution in the 17th century, and then in the late 18th century there was a more general industrial revolution. This completely disrupted the economic norms and labor relations that our society had become accustomed to over centuries. The demand for agricultural labor suddenly collapsed, and the population that had been spread throughout the country was suddenly upended and funneled into cities, the new urban centers, where the industrialists, businessmen, and financiers of this new economy were basically able to demand anything they wanted from them, because the balance of power and labor relations that had been negotiated over previous generations was suddenly wiped away. Productivity soared, our life became increasingly defined by the regular circulation of commodities, all the profit just accrued back to the people who owned the capital, and our society was, just like that, thrust into a new era where the wealthiest men were no longer those born into nobility who controlled all of the land with the fancy palaces and stuff, but the people who controlled the most money in a more abstract way. This gave form to and allowed many people to first articulate or conceptualize the class known as the bourgeoisie, originally coming from people of the boroughs. So the power of the landed aristocracy was waning at a time when there was a lot of social unrest and a lot of things in society were changing, and this general instability contributed to the downfall of monarchist governments, which were increasingly criticized by advocates of democracy and of increasing trade. Among the latter were English rationalists following the influence of Adam Smith, remembered most of all for his magnum opus, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. For this work he became known as the father of economics and the father of capitalism. There was very little in the way of writing about political economy before Smith, and real-world economic policy was largely determined by what is now called mercantilism, in which monarchs would operate economies for the express purpose of maximizing their national resources in a competition with other states. High import taxes or tariffs were the norm at this point, but as economies grew more developed and as resources became more plentiful, the reality of the efficiency of international trade was catching up to them, to the advantage of all countries, but to the detriment of the relative power of each monarch within their own country. So really, the rise of international trade worked against the monarchist system. I'm going to properly define, flesh out, and distinguish some of the relevant concepts floating about here. Sometimes people, including me, use the terms individual liberty, or personal rights. This is all kind of redundant, we just say it for emphasis. The very concepts are personal or individual in nature. If you ever hear me say individual liberty, I'm really just saying liberty. The individual part is just rhetoric. Now, in conversation, a lot of people mix up or use interchangeably liberty and freedom, and maybe also rights. They talk about their rights, their freedom, their liberty. These terms do have some conceptual overlap, so it's kind of understandable, but we should be able to tell the difference between them.
Freedom, 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 oi! Freedom, 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 oi!
Freedom is the most abstract, formless of these ideas. It's the state of being free, being able to take an action without restraint, being free to do such and such, or conversely to avoid having something be done to you, which is being free from such and such. Liberty then refers to a more specific subset of that idea, the set of freedoms that we have decided are socially important. So it's not just freedom, and it's not just any set of freedoms, but these freedoms that we have decided are the ones worth protecting. So liberty could also be called or understood as our traditional freedoms. A right, meanwhile, is any legal entitlement. Some of your rights are part of what we consider liberty, but some aren't. As a concept, a right is just anything that you're legally entitled to. Freedom and liberty as concepts come into natural conflict with one another, because one person's demand for a certain type of freedom may conflict with the essential freedoms of others and therefore be destructive to liberty. For my freedom to be absolute and maximal, for me to be free to do anything I want and to be free from anything I don't want to happen to me, I'm basically a god, I'm a dictator, I can do anything I want. Which basically means your freedom has been destroyed, because if I want to kill you, I can. If I want to steal from you, I can. And if I don't want you to speak anymore, then you have no right to. All of my freedoms have overridden all of yours. In liberty, on the other hand, we may coexist in harmony because there has been a balance created by each of us having the right to some freedoms but not others. So while the word freedom is easy to shout and celebrate, it's really liberty, not simply freedom, the traditional balance of freedoms that our society has negotiated, that is the thing we ought to celebrate and protect. In modern political talk, people often distinguish between positive rights and negative rights, typically people who want to stress the importance of the latter. The concept here, the nature of this distinction, is that for us to oblige a positive right, say to water, demands us taking action, providing them with water, whereas to oblige a negative right, say to free expression, doesn't require us do anything, or rather, if anything, it demands inaction or restraint. It requires, in other words, that we don't do something to restrict their free expression, which could also be accomplished by us just not being there in the first place. Our absence would accomplish their free expression. Conversely, to deprive somebody of a positive right means to no longer take some action to provide something to them, while to deprive somebody of a negative right means to take some kind of action against them. So it's really all about the action-inaction distinction. A different way of saying this is that negative rights are the ones that you have by default. If you were to be alone in the wilderness or stranded on a deserted island, all of your negative rights would still be with you. Everything that you have a negative right to, you would still have access to on the island. Whereas your positive rights wouldn't, because your positive rights require the labor of other people to provide. It wouldn't really make sense to talk about your right to legal counsel on an island with no other people, right? Nor would I even say that you're being denied your rights in such a case. For us to use that language to say that you're being denied your rights would require that there are other people around who have the ability to fulfill your rights but choose not to. So this distinction makes sense in theory, in our imagination, when we talk about a hypothetical scenario, or at least it kind of makes sense. The problem is that in isolation, if there were no society for you to speak of, none of these things would really be rights at all. Just as in the absence of society, there would be no laws or manners. If you're the only person on Earth, nothing that you do could be rude or illegal. We don't have a right in any real sense until there is a society to recognize and affirm it. And concepts like this are only interpretable in a social context. It's the relations between people and institutions that give rise to rights and laws and manners and all other sorts of things. These are social concepts that are not applicable to a deserted island. And if we narrow the scope of our analysis to real societies, this distinction between positive and negative rights blurs. Freedom only feels like the default in isolation because you imagine there are no other people around to infringe upon your desires in any way. But the natural state of humanity isn't isolation, it's community. From the smallest tribe or village to a big city, until some means of common defense is organized, your freedom is incredibly insecure because any random person who comes along could take it away from you. You could be snuck up on, you could be overpowered, you could be outnumbered, and then without any social systems to rely on, your freedom is entirely forfeit. It's only after we all come together and make systems of force that we get law and order, and it's from law and order that we get safety, liberty, and peace. None of these things existed by default. They're not free like the air. They're manufactured, constructed, the product of humanity, of our social development. So negative rights, insofar as negative means that it doesn't need to be provided for you by somebody else, are really only negative in theory. In practice, all rights are de facto positive rights in the sense that they all require enforcement and therefore the labor of other people in order to be provided to you, by police, by courts, by civil services, by the military, or by something else. You are not a one-man army, and your rights do not enforce themselves. So how useful is this positive-negative distinction, really? It makes sense in our head, but if our goal is to understand and describe how actual societies function, instead of taking a fun little detour where we talk about men on a deserted island, the positive-negative distinction just doesn't seem very useful to me. I don't think it ever matters whether a right is positive or negative. The necessity of systems of force in order to have any rights at all, positive or negative, was understood rather early in the development of political philosophy. In his 1651 book, Leviathan, the grand old philosopher himself, Thomas Hobbes, describes how the natural condition of mankind is only the laws of nature, which leads to a war of all against all, or as he actually said, a war of every man against every man, in which people are free to do anything, including assault, kill, rape, steal, enslave. Nobody is safe. Nobody's rights are secure. Such a world would have no industry, no culture, no agriculture, no recorded knowledge, only fear and darkness and a likely violent death. And it's only by the creation of the state and our shared submission to that state that allows humanity to ascend beyond this. That is the great insight which still eludes too many. Liberty does not exist by default. Rather, it's something humanity must work to create and work to preserve. And the mechanism for both this creation and preservation is the organization of violence and the application of authority. And for this we must all pay significant cost, both in the form of accepting obligations to the system and accepting restraints put on us by the system. In other words, paying our dues and following the law. Rights realism. The American and French revolutions both had lasting effects on our political language, from their speeches, journals, and pamphlets to the language they wrote into official documents. They were all inheriting from the Enlightenment, this period of intellectual change in Europe in the 17th to 18th century, roughly, when liberal ideas were being developed in reaction to monarchy, led on by influential writers like Rousseau, Descartes, Voltaire, John Locke, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and others. Some of its major themes were a rejection of the divine right of kings, a belief in the separation of church and state, and advocacy for religious freedom and tolerance. Though not without some costs, the Enlightenment helped usher in an age of prosperity and reform across Europe. Part of the downside is that for all the good it brought, Enlightenment philosophy wasn't perfect. But the success of these revolutions and the influence of these particular writers meant that any mistakes or shortcomings of the era were crystallized in these various documents, like the Declaration of Independence, to be studied, revered, and celebrated for years to come as our national artifacts, which means that the shortcomings I'm alluding to are particularly tenacious. And the one that I'm especially interested in here is what I already said, rights realism. Though both revolutions, the American and the French, were both significantly anti-religious in sentiment, and especially anti-Catholic in the French case, leading to the violent persecution of many innocent priests and nuns, by the way, but they naturally couldn't help still appealing to ideas that were religious in origin, Sort of like how an atheist today might still say, "Oh my god," as an expression of surprise. Especially troublesome was the notion that our political rights are not created socially, but inexplicably just exist in some kind of independent manner, as though an objective feature of the world. This implicit view lacks a conventional name and often isn't spoken of, but I'm calling it rights realism, and I'm speaking of it. Look at the American revolutionaries, for example, who opposed the formation of a state church, they ensured their people's right to religious freedom, and they at least didn't mention any specific religion in their founding documents, but still they burned these words into history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The French Revolution, meanwhile, gave us liberty, equality, fraternity, or liberté, égalité, fraternité, a motto popularized by Robespierre himself, and so memorable, so much sticking to the French national consciousness that it would later become the country's official motto. Yet this discourse about liberty was celebrated entirely in the abstract. It's talked about not as a feature of society, but as an axiom of the mind, something that exists independently detached from any notion of duty, allegiance, or responsibility. So too was this the case in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, that great human rights document published by the French National Assembly and later incorporated as part of the French Constitution. Article 2. The goal of any political association is the conservation and the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance against oppression. Yes, how convenient. At least they didn't explicitly mention a creator as their origin the way the Americans did. Now, I can imagine that the purpose of this rhetoric at the time was to arm the revolution with feelings of clarity, certainty, and confidence. And to that end, maybe it was successful, but if taken as a real, serious belief, as more than only political rhetoric, a modicum of scrutiny reveals how vacuous this kind of talk is. How do I know that a creator has endowed me with something, whatever that means? Like, where is my right to liberty? What are we talking about? Where did God put it in my body? Can we find it? Which rights was I endowed with and which was I not endowed with? Who decides this? Who gets to say which rights are natural and which aren't? Like, am I supposed to say that all people, even slaves in ancient history, we all had a right to our freedom, even if we didn't know that we did? Like, it's possible for everybody to have a right, but nobody knows that we have a right? How can such a right be said to exist? What does it even mean at that point? Like, if I have a right to water, but I don't know that I have a right to water, and nobody else in the world knows that I have a right to water, and it's not written down anywhere, and I don't actually get water in practice, I'm being denied the right to water, then in what possible sense would you say that I have a right to water? It sounds to me like I actually don't have a right to water. It's just the most vacuous way of talking about this. Like, this is so nebulous. This would be like if somebody said that the English language existed 2 million years ago, but nobody knew how to speak it, or read it, or write it. But it just existed in some mystical sense. What are we saying at that point? How does it exist? Like, it's so nonsense. I think the best actual explanation for rights realism as like a phenomenon of the way that people talk, like the best explanation for why people talk this way without really examining it too closely, is that it was basically just a repurposing of the logic behind the divine right of kings. It was an inversion of the way that monarchists reasoned. Like if you heard somebody say, the king has a right to rule because God said so, and then you thought, oh, you can just do that? You can just tack because God said so at the end of a bunch of normative statements about how society should work? Okay, let's do it. I have a right to this, this, and this because God endowed me with those rights. Whatever that means. Don't look too closely, and I'm not taking any questions. This is why even if you remove all the explicit references to a god or creator, as the French revolutionaries did, rights realism is still a religious idea in the sense that it's an idea born of religious thinking. It was just an idea that was superficially secularized by us crossing out God from the idea, but it's still functioning the same way. All such talk really communicates is the opinions of those authors that these rights are especially important, and ergo all people ought to be granted them. And if that is what was actually expressed, it would be a fair position. The waters are only muddied because the language that people use, like unalienable, natural, or imprescriptible, implies that there's something else going on here, something more, something grander than just a person expressing their values. But there's not. There is nothing more. That is all it is. Nor is there any more when it comes to the term human rights, which is a term that I have no problem using. When we say human rights, we just mean the rights that are so basic, but also so important, that we should probably afford them to all humans by default, regardless of who they are. But saying this is just your opinion or an expression of your values somehow doesn't sound quite as grand as claiming that God agrees with you. Also, my favorite movies, those are also God's favorite movies. He told me himself, so I'm actually objectively have good taste. A lack of appreciation for the social nature of rights or liberty leads to various ideological mishap, let's say, not only in more idealistic liberals like the Founding Fathers, but also of serious condemnations of the very institutional violence necessary for liberty or rights to exist, such as by left-wing anarchists in Europe in the 19th century, or right-wing libertarians, who are also sometimes called anarchists, in 20th century America. Though they approach the topic from different angles and they have different ends in mind, they make the same fundamental error in reasoning. They think the state is actually the enemy of their liberty, and so because we want to maximize liberty, we should seek to eliminate the state. The rationale here was all too simple. The government restricts our freedom in some ways, such as by making laws that forbid you from stealing or raping. Ergo, more government equals less freedom. Therefore, the reverse must also be true. If you have less government, then you should have more freedom. And so maximal freedom, the most freedom that we could all hope for, would be to have no government at all. And no, they don't mean the Hobbesian state of nature. They seem to mean an actual balanced sense of liberty that allows people to coexist. These people were all influenced by the American and French revolutions. In some cases they argued they were merely taking the principles of the revolution to their logical end. And there is nothing that more fascinates a certain type of person than the appearance of consistency. In the end, their positions are all comparable to a man who says that his truck travels faster the less it weighs, ergo it should probably travel even faster if he takes out the engine, since the engine is heavy. There is a glimmer of logic there, but there's also clearly just a fundamental misunderstanding of the relation of things in the situation, so it's just nonsense. Individualism. There are some people, like libertarians and anarchists, who come to view nearly all political issues through the lens of individualism versus collectivism, basically meaning the extent to which a group or institution makes demands of its individual members. They might be an extremist who thinks they should be able to do anything they want, or maybe they accept some amount of compromise to afford the necessities of civilization, but they try to keep the demands of the collective to a minimum, and they seem to approach every issue from the perspective of the individual and focus a lot on the tension or competition between these two forces. In some cases, they may even decide their position on specific policy questions simply by applying this pro-individual attitude. For example, maybe they're in favor of lowering tax rates. Why? Have they actually done any kind of reasoning or analysis about how our current tax rates are too high, and if they were lower it would lead to a better society? No. They just view taxation as the collective burdening the individual, and therefore they're against it and want it to be lower. The same person might be in favor of the legality of abortion simply because they view laws against abortion as the collective telling the individual what to do, as opposed to having any actual rationale about the morality of that issue. There is clearly an enduring appeal to a life of independence, the idea of withdrawing yourself in some way or another from the structure and rules of civilization, to be your own man and take matters into your own hands. It offers the possibility to live as close as possible to your natural impulses, to your unrestrained ego. That's the psychological draw of the Wild West, the cowboy, the drifter, the wanderer, the rogue, but also of the homesteader, or a small farmer living off the land, or a recluse who lives alone in a cabin in the woods, undisturbed, with maximal peace of mind, wild and free. Now, the aesthetics of such a life are admired even by people who don't turn it into ideology, but it's more something to reminisce and fantasize about than to really live, because what you would have to give up simply isn't worth it, at least not for the vast majority of humans who have ever lived. This kind of picturesque, rugged independence is more a theme that you can have in your life to some extent, but it has to be balanced with other things. You can't go full cowboy. Even after making peace with obeying the law, there are so many ways that humans naturally purchase some benefit or another by making a commitment to do something or accepting a restraint being imposed on your actions. In both cases, because doing so is what's necessary to create the thing that you're then benefiting from. For example, if you want to live in a community where other people don't steal from you, then you're going to have to agree to not steal from them. It's not the tyranny of the collective, it's a reciprocal dynamic that you choose to be a part of. There are so many situations in life where in order for this to work, we all need to do it. Or at least nearly all of us. There's usually a little bit of failure tolerance. And if we do, the benefit is well worth the cost. There's an individual pay-in for a collective pay-out. You pay an individual cost and you get a group benefit. And yet, perhaps paradoxically, if left to our own devices, we just wouldn't do it. We wouldn't bother. Even though, in theory, it's a small price to pay for a big trade-off that benefits all of us, each individual person wouldn't bother paying in if it's possible to benefit from the collective sacrifice of everybody else without contributing to that yourself. This dilemma is known as the collective action problem. The fact intelligent people acting rationally who understand the situation will so often fail to work together for their mutual benefit. This is mostly because of what's called the free rider problem, which is about the overconsumption of public goods leading to a tragedy of the commons. These are the key buzzwords to look into. All of the different choices that come together to comprise a system happen at the individual level, so in order for a system to function, it needs to make sense for the individual to engage in at the level they're acting. If a system is set up in such a way that demands people act in a way that doesn't make sense to them at their own level, then they'll probably stop acting that way, and then the system will stop working. The name free rider problem originates from a specific hypothetical situation. Imagine a city has a public train system, and in order to fund the train, you're supposed to pay a fee when you get on. If there's no enforcement mechanism, if this fee is purely voluntary, people will naturally choose not to pay it and thus become free riders. And as a result, the train company will not be able to fund the train adequately, and the system will fail. Even if all of the people could easily afford it, even if they understand that too many free riders will result in inadequate funding and therefore the trains shutting down, and even if none of them prefer that outcome, if all of them would be more than happy to pay the fee for themselves if they were the ones who made the difference and their fee kept the trains open, they would all do it. It doesn't matter, they still just won't pay. They will choose to be free riders and the train will shut down. Now at a glance, if you didn't know any better, it just kind of seems like everybody is stupid. But the reason this happens is because no one person's choice is going to be the deciding factor in whether the trains are adequately funded or not, and they all know it. If we examine this as an individual choice, they're basically just being asked to throw money away for no reason. Think of it like this. If everybody else pays the fee and I don't, the train will have enough money to keep running. They don't need me. If nobody else pays the fee but I do, then my payment alone wouldn't have been enough to keep the system afloat. The trains are either going to have enough money or they're not going to have enough money. What I do doesn't change the outcome. This is called a diffusion of responsibility, the realization that you're just a drop in the bucket. You can't change anything in the big picture, so you may as well just do whatever makes sense for you, for your pocketbook. If you want the trains to be funded, don't look at me, it's really up to everybody else to do their part. And there's a lot of situations in life that exemplify this dynamic. For example, why pay taxes? Yes, I want the government to have revenue, but surely the government could survive without my revenue. So long as everybody else pays taxes, we'll be fine. Taxation is a vital social function precisely because it allows a country to fund things that everybody wants to be funded, but which we wouldn't donate to individually because, if not so compelled, we would all just be free riders instead. Such as fare free public transit in some places. In a sense, we could also understand criminal activity and law enforcement through this lens. It benefits me to live in a place where I have safety because everybody else is a law-abiding citizen. But do you know what would benefit me even more? If everybody else followed the law but I didn't have to, and I could just go around taking anything I want. Criminal or illegal activity is almost categorically stuff that would benefit you personally but harm society, and so you want to do it in theory because it would benefit you, but you don't want other people to be able to do it because that would suck for you. So we're engaging in this big trade-off where instead none of us are allowed to do it. The most individually beneficial position would be to be the lone rule breaker, the one person in society who just breaks all of the laws. But as soon as we all start acting that way, society is ruined. So what's the solution? How do we make systems that have individual costs but shared group benefits possible? Well, depending on how I write it out, there are numerous different possible approaches, but they're all going to be different forms of the same general solution, which is that we need to make individual costs and benefits more reflective of the group costs and benefits. Which could mean offering some kind of individual benefit for group beneficial behavior, or it could mean threatening some kind of individual cost for behavior that is harmful to the group. This is how we bridge the gap between the individual and the collective, between the person and the group. We tip the scales in the cost-benefit analysis of people's individual decision-making. To say this in economic terms, our goal is to internalize the externalities. Now, for a train company, the answer is relatively simple. You hire security guards and a ticket inspector, and then you issue fines for non-compliance. You kick people off the train if you catch them without a ticket. This imposes an individual cost onto people for non-compliance with the requirements for the system to work, ergo bringing their individual cost-benefit analysis closer to what's necessary for the system to function. Suddenly, instead of either paying the fee or not paying the fee, and there being no real cost or benefit to you as an individual regardless of what you do, now it's you either pay the fee or you risk getting caught and fined, which outweighs the small benefit of not paying the fee. And just like that, people change their behavior and the system becomes possible. The trains could also have become publicly funded, though this only changes the location of the enforcement mechanism from the point of sale buying the ticket to paying your taxes. So in both cases, the solution is making it so that funding the train is no longer an individual choice. It's a mandatory thing that you have to do. Now, for other problems that we face, instead of adding a punishment for non-compliance, we might create a benefit for compliance. So long as it becomes better for the individual to comply than to not comply, the number of people who comply goes up and the system becomes more functional. And there's a bunch of approaches that can achieve this. A great example of a collective action problem that we face is voting in public elections. By itself, this is a completely irrational waste of time because your vote is never, ever going to be the thing that decides the outcome. Voting in the aggregate changes a lot, but your vote doesn't change anything. If the candidate that you voted for wins, they would have won without your vote. And if they don't win, your vote wasn't enough to change that result. So in a sense, there's no reason to bother participating. You're not going to change anything. So what we did instead was create a social environment where it's your civic duty to vote. It's an act of patriotism, even. Make your voice heard. We give you a pat on the back, we give you like a button or a sticker or something that says, I voted, and then you get to walk around town shaming anybody who didn't vote, who didn't do their part. And then tomorrow at work, we're all going to talk about who we voted for, as though it fucking matters, as a way of letting other people know that we did the thing we were supposed to do. It's all very ritualistic, and I don't mean that as a bad thing. It should be ritualistic. The reason we do all this is to create a social benefit or a psychological benefit for you, because otherwise you might just not participate in the system, and that's not good. We want you to do this. So all these little things and the whole dynamic and the way that we talk about voting all contributes to getting more people to actually vote. And by the way, if that ever wasn't effective anymore, like if we ever feel that not enough people are voting, we could go the other direction, and instead of trying to reward people for voting, we punish people for not voting by making it mandatory that you do cast a vote, and then issuing fines for people who don't. Some countries, like Australia, Ecuador, Belgium, and Luxembourg, already do this. Seems like a good idea. Maybe other countries that have low voter turnout should give it a try. Looking at you, America. If you understand the free rider dynamic, and you understand the idea of having a social duty to do certain things, like voting in elections, even when you're not necessarily forced to by law, you might try thinking of other social duties through the same lens. Your country is like a train car that you're riding with the rest of us. Just by your being here, just by you being in the car with us, you are entitled to an array of resources and services, including protection. And what is asked of you in return? What is the fee to ride this car? I suppose at minimum it's that you follow the laws of the country, including paying taxes to a common fund. And in some places you might be called to military service, depending on what's going on. You know, we might need your help if there's like an army invading trying to kill us all. And that's really all that's forcibly required of you. But everything in society works better if you go above and beyond the bare minimum. A lot of what makes a society work is not induced legally, but through social means, through social pressure, expectations being placed on you, a common sense of honor that allows things to work by honor system. All across the country, there are cafes where a barista will just set an order on the counter, and you could probably get away with just walking in and grabbing a random other person's order and walking away. I don't know if anyone would stop you. And there's laundromats in every big city where people leave their clothing in the washer and dryer and then just walk away. In theory, somebody could just walk in there and steal a bunch of clothes, and I doubt anybody would stop them. And every single day we have trucks that drive around delivering packages to people's place of residence, often just leaving a box or parcel sitting outside the front door. And those getting stolen is a problem in some places, but the vast majority of them are left unattended and are never stolen. I frequently have things delivered that just sit on the street for a few hours before I notice and go get it. I've never had anybody steal a package, I've never had anybody take my order at a cafe, I've never had anybody take my clothes from a laundromat. There is a lot of social order in our society that works just by people choosing to do what's right. But nor should you take this for granted. It doesn't just automatically end up like this. A lot of these things might not work if you just copy-paste them into a different part of the world with different norms. It requires us cultivating a certain culture where people have a sense of shame and a sense of honor and a sense of right and wrong, and where people naturally feel a sense of duty to their friends, to their family, to their community, to their government, to their nation in the broadest sense. And almost all of this is instilled in you from your upbringing, which is why one of the most basic but also the most important and fundamental way in which you can serve the interests of broader society, by which you can perform your social duty to the community and to the institutions that supported you when you were younger, is by contributing to the next generation of your society, by contributing to a family or to a household, the cell of civil society. Most obviously, you could have or raise children of your own, but failing that, you could at least try to contribute to the lives of other people's children. Be a good aunt or uncle, be a good neighbor, be a good member of your community, be a good friend to anybody you know who does have children, and try to be present and make a positive impact in their lives. The morality of other people in your society affects you not only by whether or not they're attacking you, but by how their behavior interacts with the systems in which you also have to live. If the rate at which assaults, muggings, or home break-ins increases in a given area, the demand for police presence increases there too. If shoplifting in a certain part of town becomes more common, businesses may hire more security, put up more security cameras, maybe lock some of their items behind a gate that you need an employee to help access. The worse that people generally behave, the more intrusive, costly, and demanding our systems of enforcement will become. The more present they will become in everyday life in order to effectively discipline the impulse of the people therein. To the extent that we fail to discipline our behavior via social means, social pressure, shame, honor, duty, we make up for it through actual systems of enforcement, meaning with force. So conversely, the better that people behave, the more smoothly everything works. The more we're able to trust one another and rely less on the threat of force to get people to do what's right. In a good area, in a good community, we solve disputes with honor and words, and crime is uncommon even in the absence of police presence, because people have a conscience and choose to be good. So if you have a realistic appreciation for your society, but you want it to remain as free and unburdened as possible from systems of force, then your goal should be to maintain a moral population, and you should do what you can to contribute to that end yourself. Non-compliance with social rules tends to be contagious, because for most people, social norms are intuitively reciprocal. If one student breaks a rule and gets away with it, other students will see that and think they can get away with it too. They'll even reason, if they can do it, then why can't I? If there's an implicit agreement between us and you're not upholding your end of the bargain, then I'm not going to uphold mine either. And it works both ways. If other people are being polite, it might make you think that you should probably be polite too. If nobody else is littering, it makes us feel like we shouldn't either. But if other people are not doing their part, then it makes us feel less inclined to do ours. Why restrict your actions for the good of society if other people in society are not restricting their actions for your benefit? If nobody else is being polite, there's a good chance that you're not going to be polite either. If everybody else is littering, there's a good chance that you'll say, okay, well fuck it, I'm going to litter too. And you might not do that, of course. A more virtuous person might choose to do what's good even if the people around them are not. But on the whole, across a big population, the percentage of people who continue performing the norm is going to go down when other people aren't doing it either. Even if you are normally a good person, the chances of you deciding that you're not going to bother anymore definitely increases when you see that other people aren't doing it either. Democracy. I should dedicate some time to democracy itself, considering it's become such an important part of our political tradition. For some precious decades, democracy has been a thing whose praises we all sang together. Everybody in the world seemed to recognize its importance, and its importance was never controversial. Of course, one believes in democracy. The great powers of the world all went through revolutions to become more democratic. Then in World War II and again in the Cold War, democratic countries were pitted against undemocratic ones, and twice democracy emerged victorious. Voting and criticizing our elected leaders became part of our civic identity. A broad democratic attitude became part of who we are, how we viewed ourselves. But just as democracy took work to establish, it takes work to maintain. It must be actively defended, not just taken for granted. Otherwise, people may gradually lose faith in it, tempted by the superficial allure of some other, inferior system, often one with a fiery demagogue as its advocate. I still periodically come across arguments in favor of monarchy, for example. Not only in the sense of having a royal family, but actually having that royal family be the executive branch of your government. Part of how they make this argument is identifying the advantages of having a good ruler whose position is stable and long-lasting. And of course, if you take a good, moral king who is deeply invested in the health of the nation and compare him with an unscrupulous elected politician who has no regard for what happens beyond the end of his term, the king is appealing. I can think of some kings whom I'd rather have over some elected officials. But what if these things are not bundled together in that way? What if this isn't the comparison that we get to make? What about the cruel, stupid monarch? And what about the principled, competent governor whom the people elected? Of course, if you get to craft every aspect of the comparison, then you can show us the best possible A and the worst possible B, and you can say, look, this makes A seem pretty good. But what about the average of both groups? Or the average results of the implementations of both strategies? Including the fact that if you ever have a bad elected official, you can vote them out of office, whereas if you have a bad king, you can't. In making these comparisons, they essentially ask that you disregard all of the great elected leaders that we've had and all of the monarchs throughout history who have ruined their own countries through mismanagement and brutality, despite the guaranteed longevity of their inherited positions, even though that would make you think, in theory, that they should be more cautious and prudent about how they govern. But tell that to reality. I understand why it makes sense in our head, but it often doesn't work out that way. In some sense, monarchy is the most natural form of government. It's the one that appeared naturally all over the world and all throughout history, in societies that are otherwise as different from each other as they could possibly be. But that's because what even is monarchy as a system? It's not a very complex idea. It's basically just the reality that there's always going to be some kind of apex position, one person who's more powerful than all the other people, mixed with a society that allows this position itself to be inherited per the will of the previous ruler. You can imagine any group of cavemen fighting over who gets to be in charge of stuff. As soon as one of them wins, I guess he's the ruler, and as soon as there's a social environment where he's able to leave that position to his son, there you go, it begins. Now it's a monarchy. One powerful dude whose authority is inherited. It's undeniably intuitive because all people understand family and inheritance, and the desire to pass things down to your children. And if the public have got to know a certain ruler and become loyal to him, they'll probably have an easier time transferring that feeling of loyalty to the ruler's child than to some other person. They might even already think, without needing to be taught or propagandized into thinking, that this is kind of the child's right. It's his right to inherit the throne or the crown or whatever. The rightful prince who was a spitting image of his father whom we loved, and now he's following in the king's footsteps just as the king would have wanted. Of course we'll follow you, my prince. This is clearly the right thing to do. As for the king's perspective, there's going to be few people he can more trust to replace him someday than his own child whom he's raised for the position. There also used to be more of a problem when it came to finding people who were qualified to be in positions of leadership. The pool of options would have been a lot slimmer. The vast majority of people in society weren't even literate. They knew nothing about government or diplomacy or finance or the military, but a prince, born into the world of power, was actually pretty likely to be the most qualified person to become king anyway. Now today, most of these advantages have been wiped away due to widespread technology and education, and for the fact that we've developed our national identity in such a way that most people are more loyal to values or institutions than to specific families. The latter harks quaintly back to our clan culture before the formation of cities and empires and modern political philosophy, when power, when decision-making authority, was held by the heads of the powerful families, the tribal elders, or what have you, when people were more likely to know their local authorities personally. There may still be some social value to be had through that kind of traditional family relation. Just ask Europeans how they feel about their figurehead royal families. But the simple reality is that how much most of the public cares about this sort of thing has been declining. So the progression from monarchy to democracy should probably be thought of as part of the natural progression of a society's development, the state itself beginning as something we think of as the property of the ruler, but then over time it transitions into being something we think of as belonging to the public. There's a powerful family or group of families, warriors, aristocrats, and they have some kind of territory that they rule over, some kind of area where they are the ones that have authority, and their authority reigns supreme. But they don't reign supreme way over there. If you go far enough that other direction, there's some other powerful family. So there's necessarily territories. And then it's just a matter of society growing from the small tribe where everybody knows each other and authority is very personal into the big society where relationships are more abstract because everybody doesn't know each other. So then you have a concept of a nation that emerges, a concept of a national identity in which people consider themselves to be a member, and that changes the dynamic of power between ruler and ruled. Somewhere along the way, it becomes less about them being king of this territory and more about them being king of this people, or of this nation. We stop calling him King of France and we start calling him King of the French. So there's a conceptual change that emerges, and then over time, as conflict arises between different institutions, between the monarch and other people in society, as the economy develops in such a way that allows for a lot of dispersed power that is not just held by the landed aristocracy, and as the monarch, through acts of compromise, signs away a lot of his power to some kind of alternate institution, well, now I'm just describing the real way in which democracy emerged over time. I don't think monarchy is an immoral form of government. If there were some country that had a reasonable monarch and that was working out well for them, I feel like slavery is immoral, and I feel like mass killings are immoral, and it is possible for a monarch to engage in stuff that we consider really bad, but just being a monarchy I don't think is necessarily a problem. If that monarch or whoever inherits the position ends up doing a bunch of stuff that the public in that country doesn't like, then maybe they'll end up moving in the direction of democracy just like we did in our past. But there isn't necessarily a rush to do that, there's no imperative that it has to come to an end immediately. Let them do it at their own pace. Now before I go, I want to clarify some things about the spirit of democracy. There is more to being a democracy or being a democratic society than just voting for things. There is also a broader democratic political culture, a spirit of democracy, the idea that the government should be a reflection of the population, of the values and priorities of the populace. Now, one of the primary mechanisms to express this is voting, but for that to be politically meaningful also requires that people are able to criticize their leaders, to organize an opposition, and to advocate for that opposition against the current government. In this way, a democratic system requires not only voting, but a certain degree of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, the right to run for office, the right to vote without any intimidation or interference, and possibly other things. It's really these elements coming together that creates a democratic environment, one in which it's feasible for the public to oppose and replace its own political leadership. Why should this be the case? What's so great about this spirit of democracy? The most obvious answer is that we think it's important for the government to be a reflection of the values and priorities of its population to help reduce conflict between us and the government. If an undemocratic government were in place and able to just do whatever it wants, well, eventually there's going to be conflict between it and the population. And if that continues for some time, there's eventually going to be revolts, violence, social instability. But there's a lot of potential variation in how this democratic spirit be implemented exactly. For most problems, it's enough that we elect the people who make the decisions. But there is also room among the many procedures that make up our government for some practices that are not directly democratic in the sense that it's done through voting. Sometimes you're just going to want a few qualified people to make a decision about something because it's really complex and the public wouldn't know how to vote about it. But that doesn't seriously conflict with our general commitment to the spirit of democracy, and these things can still be democratically confirmed. That is to say, most people in society can express that they're actually fine with delegating a certain decision to a certain body of decision makers for some particular purpose. Every country in the world has some kind of government agency whose job is to inspect pharmaceuticals and to enforce the relevant safety regulations. How does Canada decide whether a pill is safe for market? We don't hold a national vote about it. We don't have a referendum. Do you think this pill is safe? We have an agency called Health Canada. They decide. This is also what's done when it comes to making legislation. Part of the value of a representative democracy is that making laws is not actually simple. You need people who can take abstract desires, like, I wish our public transit system was better, and turn that into actionable policy. Figure out how the law is going to be written, decide what's going to fund it. Most people have no idea how these systems function. We don't know how to appropriate funds to the right departments, we don't know what aspects of everything are important, or what the consequences will be of slight changes in the way that we word a bill. There are some issues where it's not really like this, where it's less about implementation and more about the sentiment of the matter. For an issue like that, holding a referendum might be entirely appropriate. I think a good example of this is whether the state should recognize same-sex marriage. It's not really a policy question that we can consult the experts about, it's just a matter of what most people feel. When it's a question of culture or morality, that's often all we're really talking about. We can also agree preemptively to rules that sort of augment democratic expression, so things begin with the people but then are filtered through various procedures. A simple example would be in a republic where you have a national assembly of elected representatives. If we agree ahead of time that we're only ever going to pass bills that have at least 55% support, which means if next year there's a bill that has 53% support, then we're in kind of a funny situation, because what that means is that the majority doesn't win, and instead the 48% gets their way. But this is presumably something that a majority would have had to agree to in the first place. So if I were part of that 53%, I'm going to say, okay, I voted in favor of this bill, I like this bill, but it shouldn't pass because I also agree that a bill should require 55%. So sometimes a specific procedure can feel a little anti-democratic in the moment if you zoom into a particular frame of the overall picture, but here again there is no serious conflict between having a commitment to such a procedure and having an overall commitment to the spirit of democracy. The tyranny of the majority. Speaking of the 53% not getting their way sometimes, every so often there's a disagreement about policy and the option that's popular with voters is considered by its opponents to be unfair. And they say, this is the tyranny of the majority. The concept, in some name or another, has been part of our political thought so long as there has been political thought. When people act in groups, or angry mobs you might say, the cost or blame of any wrongdoing that comes about as a result of their action is split among the crowd. There's a diffusion of responsibility. So people who are organized into the form of an angry mob may choose to do things that they wouldn't have as an individual, when all of the cost and blame would be on them alone. And once an angry mob has decided on the path it wants to go down, there can be a lot of pressure on each individual person to just go with the flow, to participate in what other people are already doing. They just get caught up in things. We all influence one another. So what if the result of this dynamic is that a majority of people all get together and choose to commit injustice? What if everybody in society moves to murder that one guy nobody likes? And if we allow political decisions to be made democratically, are we kind of acting as a mob and therefore possibly more susceptible to committing injustice? Again, these fears are not novel, they've been around forever, but they're also not totally unjustified. They're the reason that we have anti-democratic checks baked into the design of our system to begin with. Our governments were forged by people who had all of these same thoughts and fears. But let's take a step back for a second and ask, what does it even mean for something to be an injustice in the first place? Because it does sound odd that most people in society would choose injustice. If you were to hold a big survey where you ask every single person, is this act injustice? And the majority of people said no, then how do we know it is injustice? Isn't such a designation somewhat subjective? Like, imagine if every single other person in the world, except for you and I, thought that some particular action was just, but we disagreed. We felt as though it was unjust. Well, what could we do to prove that we're right and everybody else is wrong? It's not like chemistry or something. We can't go into a lab and prove it. We can't zoom in and show it to you, like, look, there it is on the monitor, there's the injustice particles. The best I could do is probably try to establish some kind of common ground and persuade people to recognize they're being inconsistent, if they are, but otherwise I don't think I can prove or disprove things like this, and even that approach depends on us being able to find common ground, or areas where our intuitions are alike, so in trying to determine what is or isn't just, there is still some level of deference being made to what real people think. So I feel like there's two actual possibilities here. The first is, this person, who is claiming that there is a tyranny of the majority, is somebody who disagrees with a popular idea, and they have some sense of justice that might be different from that held by most people. What if they're just kind of a strange person who has an unusual sense of what is or is not tyrannical?
It is all about the consent of the governed. If I'm using the roads in a commercial capacity whatsoever, there's an issue. But I have no contract with the state. I do not have no driver's license with the state. I have not given up my consent to the right to a locomotion and free travel.
You're riding your motorcycle illegally on a public road in the state of Washington, and you don't have a license.
Correct, I don't need to have a license.
I mean, you do.
You're driving with no insurance and wrong number plates. So you're going to be getting a traffic ticket today, and the vehicle is going to be towed. Okay?
No, I don't agree to that. I don't consent to any of this.
You guys are going to try and criminally harass me into your compliance.
So when I hear concerns about tyranny of the majority, there is a possibility that it's just not really that tyrannical at all. Alternatively, and this is probably the more reasonable scenario, the crowd itself is doing something that its own members will consider unjust, even by their own standards, after the fact. After they calm down and go home and then reflect on what they've done. They might realize, holy shit, what did we just do? People can be hasty, impassioned, not thinking clearly in the moment, and then regret their actions later. This is probably the kind of scenario that I would agree is tyranny of the majority, because the majority is choosing to act in a way that, even by its own standards, is injustice. But this is why we have procedure. This is why things don't happen instantly. When there's a decision to be made about something controversial, we delay. We mull things over. There are motions that you need to go through. We're not actually a medieval village full of pitchfork and torch-wielding peasants. We have a parliament and a judicial system. So this is really less an argument against democracy and more an argument against vigilante action and in favor of institutional action. Actually, I feel like this first case deserves a little more attention. Do you have any opinions that a majority, more than 50% of your society, disagrees with? I expect you do. I hope you do, actually. I hope everybody does. It'd be really weird if you didn't. Is that even possible? But for most things, in most places where people disagree, you probably wouldn't call the contrary position tyranny or tyrannical. Though there is some ambiguity, language like tyranny, oppression, or evil, these are usually reserved for something of more grave importance that touches on something more fundamental. It isn't just a label for anything that I disagree with. So let's ask a different question. Is there anything that a majority of the people in your society, more than 50% of the people in your society, agree with or support that you consider tyranny? I thought about this for a while. I don't think there is. I live in a pretty good country. I don't think these people support anything tyrannical. But there are some places in the world where I don't live where a majority of their people do consider things that I would consider oppressive, at least, pretty unfair, unjust. There are some countries where women are treated really badly, but I think most of the people there support it. And there's other countries where people mistreat religious minorities, ethnic minorities, people of a low caste. Is the situation in these countries an instance of tyranny of the majority? I guess, but I think we could also just call them instances of tyranny. I mean, does it matter that a lot of people support it? I feel like in a situation like that, where a majority of people are in favor of something oppressive and, would vote based on that issue, I feel like I would just try to do what I can to change people's views over time, rather than supporting an undemocratic government that would pass policies I agree with. A situation like this is the exact place where a lot of people pose a criticism of democracy because they say, well, the voting public is supporting an oppressive thing, and an undemocratic government might oppose the oppressive thing, so therefore in this instance democracy gets you oppression. Oppression is bad, therefore you shouldn't endorse democracy. Although you could replace oppression in this equation with just any kind of outcome that I don't like. And you could also ask this about our countries. I mean, would I support my country falling into a dictatorship if the dictator was going to do only the things that I personally value and agree with? Well, no. The problem with this type of critique isn't even that I just automatically believe in democracy no matter the results. It's that you have to be more generalized and long-term oriented. We prefer democracy to dictatorship because, and I believe this is true, democracy is generally a better way of governing that is more likely to have good outcomes. So essentially you're just asking, what about a rare outlier case, an exception to the norm, where instead dictatorship leads to better outcomes? Well, okay, it might lead to better outcomes right now in the short term, since that's what you're writing into the hypothetical, but I don't think it would be sustainable, and I don't think it would lead that country in a positive direction. Even if a dictator somehow figures out all of the right decisions, all of the right policies, he passes all of the right laws or orders, well, what happens if next year he doesn't get it right? What happens if he changes his tune in the near future? By accepting a dictatorship, we've surrendered our ability to get rid of him in the future if something goes wrong. And even if this dictator was exceptionally sensible, what about the next dictator? Now take a step back for a second. Is this even a realistic dilemma? How often is it the case that the will of the majority is the side of oppression, and then the will of a dictator or whatever, some other undemocratic form of government, is the side of liberty? It may happen sometimes, it's not impossible, but look at the trends around the world today. Are democracies generally more oppressive than undemocratic countries? No, of course not. Those other countries we were all thinking of where everybody treats women badly and it's illegal to be gay and they treat their religious minorities badly and all that other oppressive stuff, those are like the least democratic countries. So why are we even putting so much thought into hypotheticals like this? It's just not realistic. I think the crux of the issue for any anti-democratic movement is going to be, how is any country realistically improved if we just make it more difficult for people to get rid of their rulers in the event that things go wrong? In the event that their government starts trending toward tyranny or oppression, you want the public to just be helpless about that? I think framing it this way helps to quickly clarify the absurdity that runs through a lot of authoritarian thought. So I believe we've effectively covered all major points. Liberalism as the philosophy of the West arose naturally out of monarchy, and its major tenets, which I keep referring to as the 3 pillars of liberalism, are democracy, rule of law, and traditional liberty. And it's not a coincidence that these 3 things come together. It's a package deal. You need all 3. They relate to one another, they depend on one another, and conservatism as a political attitude arose primarily in response to revolutions, to articulate the value of traditions and institutions, to caution us against radical change, and to humble us about our place within and our view of the world. What the hell is going on today? Look at our political parties, our political leaders, our news media, our social media. I find it all surreal at times. Look at Donald Trump and his Republican Party. Is this conservatism? Is this the philosophy of humility and prudence that I mean when I say conservatism? By now it should be obvious the answer is no, and I don't have a full account of how things came to be this way. I don't think there is a red thread going from men like Smith or Burke down to politicians like Trump or Farage or J.D. Vance. I feel like it's just a matter of the language getting all mixed up, where conservatives were at some point considered the right, and therefore anything that is right-wing got mixed up with conservatism, but these people are not conservatives in any sense, and a conservative attitude does not commit you to supporting whatever party is considered right-wing in your country's politics. It would be nice if one day I could convince people that conservative and right-wing are not synonyms. They're categories with some overlap, but right-wing is not the thing that you should feel attached to. The designations of left and right are not useless, but they're also just party associations. It's largely coincidental, and it shifts around over time depending on the particularities of your country's political culture. Just in America, for example, it seems like the right wing used to be more pro-immigration and the left was more anti-immigration, but now somehow these positions have swapped around. If you go back even further, party alignment eventually had almost nothing to do with whether something was conservative or maybe even right-wing or left-wing. Most of the variation was just a matter of what region you were from. Political parties were very internally inconsistent. And there are some tendencies which appear to be compatible at least with either left or right, but for some reason have come to be associated specifically with one or the other, such as environmentalism or religiosity. For some reason environmentalism is considered left-wing and religiosity is considered right-wing, despite the history of environmentalism among conservatives and despite the role religion has played in reform movements. Except when talking about the extremes of politics, for the purpose of distinguishing between them, as the far left and the far right, I don't really care whether any given thing is more left-wing or right-wing, because left and right are just arbitrary associations that are more coincidental than an expression of any particular ideas or principles. I don't think the intellectuals in our history, whom we now look to as kind of defining conservative thought, were preoccupied with whether any given thing they were saying was more left-leaning or more right-leaning within the politics of their day. In my view, conservatism is centrist. That is to say, it can manifest in what people call either center-right or center-left parties. And I personally strongly favor the center-left ones only because the right wing has completely lost its fucking mind recently, or at least in the Anglosphere it has. The Republican Party just harbors too much stupidity, too much hatred, too much religious lunacy. They don't simply overlook these things, they harness them. They attempt to utilize them as a force to win elections. But as we say, if you gaze long into the abyss gazes back into you. Maybe it began merely as a force the party utilized, but over time it invaded and by now has become the party. Did you hear that only a few days ago a televangelist fraud named Paula White Cain led a public prayer at the White House comparing Donald Trump with Jesus Christ? This kind of performative religiosity, which is ironically rather blasphemous, has been an increasingly visible part of the right-wing milieu for the last few decades. And, perhaps because in the past conservatives were more aligned with business interests, more opposed to socialist and communist groups, it seems that right-wing parties have been hollowed out to some extent by corporate interests, and instead of a party of conservatism, you find a party of giving things away to the rich while neglecting the poor and neglecting our national infrastructure. Oh, and now of neglecting the environment, as denying climate change has become part of the mainstream right once again. The Democratic Party does not, in the same way that the Republican Party does, embrace hatred or stupidity in their followers or leaders, though they do still harbor some bad ideas or sentiment at times. Like left-wing parties in some other countries, they're often too weak on violent crime, they're too permissive of immigration, and they sometimes do too much to try and punish the wealthy and thus end up harming the national economy for the rest of us too. However, alongside any policy disagreements, and those three that I mentioned, though I'm not dedicating much time to them, are substantial, I must in my own thinking also acknowledge that the left-wing politicians we have today are simply better people. They're more honest, they're more law-abiding, they're more respectful, they're less corrupt, they care about fairness, they try to do what is good. Even when I feel a left-wing politician is being foolish, I don't often perceive it as malice. By comparison, the entire modern right and the Anglosphere are a bunch of cheaters, liars, frauds, and criminals. They've embraced being the villains. They don't care about the truth or the law, they just want to win by any means they can. They're flippant and disrespectful. The Republican Party has destroyed any semblance of professional decorum in America. Even if I sided with them in every policy question, the personal misconduct and dishonesty of their leaders would make it impossible for me to in good conscience participate in the mainstream of right-wing politics. I want political leaders who are intelligent, honest, law-abiding, who actually care about our values and their oath of office. And today such people only exist on the Democratic side of things. For that, I could potentially overlook a lot of policy disagreement. So for an American audience, the quickest way to understand me might be to say that I'm a conservative Democrat. I have a high opinion of the German Right Coalition, of the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, and of some American politicians who seem to be intelligent, competent, experienced people like Kamala Harris or Alyssa Slotkin. Joe Biden and Barack Obama were both good, sensible leaders as well. It's really just the Republican Party that ruins everything. Wow, this video is pretty fucking long. If you're somebody who watched all this, thank you so much for your attention and interest. I find all of these topics really interesting, so I'm happy for the opportunity to talk about them, and I really hope that some of what I've said here has been helpful or clarifying to you in the way that you think about politics. This was a topic that I had kind of rumbling around in the background of my mind for a long time before I got around to making it all and putting it all together. It's very time-consuming, and I'm going to be happy to go back to making much shorter videos than this one probably. I'm a YouTuber, so blah blah blah, please like and subscribe and comment and press the bell. If you found this video at all interesting, I would love it if you could share it with anybody else you think might find it interesting too. This video actually took me about 5 days to record. I've just been putting on the exact same outfit every day so that it kind of looks like no time is passing, but a lot of fucking time is passing. I started recording this in March. It's actually April now. I gotta flip this. As for why I hadn't already done that, this calendar is actually decorative. The days don't line up because it's from a few years ago. I just keep it on the wall because it's just something to have on the wall, I guess.